show you how I cast on for Magic Loop and hopefully give you some hints and tips to make life a bit easier. For Magic Loop you need circular needles. My recommendation is to have them about 50 to 60 centimetres longer than the circumference of your knitting. So for socks I use an 80 centimetre or a 32 inch circular needle, which is what this is. If I was going to do something like 2 at a time, I'd probably use 100, or possibly on a hat. I would prefer to use a 40 on a hat. But so you could, I have known people to use 60, but I find it's way too restrictive with the loop, so I would recommend the 80. So to cast on for Magic Loop, you just cast on the number of stitches that your pattern tells you to, all onto the one needle tip. So what I'm going to do is, not normally when you work in Magic Loop, you're working in the round, and generally you want a stretchy edge because it has to go over something, so like for a sock cuff or a hat. So I'm just going to cast on this. I'm using a twisted German cast on. I do have a tutorial for this on my blog if you want to know how to do it. The trick is when you want a loose cast on, you can use any technique, but obviously a stretcher cast on will give you a stretchier edge. I've seen a lot of people say to do a cast on using casting on over 2 needles, so you have the second needle like this and you cast on over both, and yes, that gives you a stretchier edge, but what it's actually doing is making your stitches taller, and that excess does go in between, but it just makes a very messy edge. So if you think about it, the trick to making a stretchy edge is you want the stretch to be between the stitches. You want to have stretch that way. So the trick is to space your stitches out on your needles, so a good finger's width apart like that, and you can see that the stretch is in here and not on your stitches. So just cast on with a gap between your stitches and you're going to have a nice stretchy edge that way. I'm going to come back when I've got all my stitches cast on. Okay, so I've cast on all of my stitches for my sock. I'm doing a smaller number than normal, so you're not having to watch me knit too much. So I've cast on 48. So to get to the point where you need to Magic Loop, you need to move all these stitches off the needle onto the cable. And what I tend to do is, when you're checking your stitch count, is when you get to the halfway point, use a lockable marker and pop that in. So my halfway point is 24 stitches. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 22 and 4. So this is my halfway point. Try not to catch any of the thread when you do that. There's 2 reasons for this. One is it stops you having to recount, because I normally would count all the way through and then have to recount halfway, but this way I only need to do it once. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 22, 40, yeah, my halfway point. So what you need to do now is find your halfway point. So if you haven't done this, just count again. And some brands of needle are easier to do this with than others. This one's quite an easy one because it's quite flexible, but some of the thicker cables could be quite hard. So one trick is to fold it in half at that point and then push it through. The other reason I put this stitch marker on is because if you just hold on and pull that, it saves a lot of fiddling about and it pulls it through to halfway. So I've pulled all the cable through, and I'm now going to pop all the stitches back onto the needles. Now there's a couple of different ways to join in the round. You can at this point just start knitting. I find that gives a bit of a loose join here, which you can fix with your tail, but it's sometimes nicer to have that already sorted. So if I was about to do that, I would just start knitting. What you do need to make sure is you've got no twist in this cast on. So the way that I find the easiest to manage this is to make sure all your cast on is pushed to the inside of the needles. Make sure there's no twist anywhere. And then at this point, hold on to it like that and it can't untwist on you. And this is another reason why a firm cast on the needles is beneficial, because if it was loose on the needles, it will want to twist, it will want to move, but because it's sat on the needles, it doesn't want to move as much. So I can just start knitting now, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap the last and first stitch over onto different needles, and that way it will join it up in the round. It'll be nice and firm. So to start off, you need to have this working yarn on the front needle, so I'm just going to flip that and again make sure that my cast on's okay. Now to swap these two stitches round on Magic Loop is a bit trickier. I will always suggest doing the one that doesn't have the working yarn on first, because if you do this one first, that one just won't go over the other. So this last one, the way I cast on, I use a slip knot, so if I take this off, that is not going anywhere, that's not going to run, it's not going to do anything, so I can just take it off and I'm just going to move it over onto that needle tip. So that's one stitch. I've still got my cast on in the middle, no twists. So that's my first stitch now on the other needle. This one's loads easier because it's your working yarn. You can just pull it loose. If you can't get to it, just use a needle to loosen it. You can loosen it as much as you like and take it off the needle that it's on and put it on the other needle, and then you pull it back snug again. And when you do that, make sure that it is sat at the end and it hasn't slid over this stitch. So I'm in the round. I don't need to hold on to it anymore because it's not going to twist now. So this join here's got a nice tight fit and you're not going to have any stretch. So to start knitting in the round, the one that's got this slightly harder to see at this point because I've moved the stitches around, but the back needle is the one that's got the working yarn, and this is the position you always want your needles to be in. So the back needle has a working yarn, your needle tips pointing towards the right. So depending on what you're about to start with, if it's a purl stitch, you can leave your yarn there. If it's a knit stitch, I recommend flipping it over this needle because it gets really annoying if you don't, because it will get stuck into your wire. So the one that's got the working yarn on that needle tip, you pull that to the right until you have half your cable on the right and half the cable on your left. So I've got sort of bunny ears going on. So I've got an empty needle now that I can use to knit across. So I'll be doing the first row of my pattern across here, and because my yarn was over here, it's not stuck in this loop. So I'm just going to do a knit purl, or knit 2, purl 2 across to the end of the row. I'm just nearing the end of this needle. So when I've got an empty needle like this, it will look something like that. I'm just going to take off that stitch marker, unless you've already done it, because you can use your tail end to show where the beginning of the round is. So the trick or the problem with Magic Loop is often getting your bearings with how it works. So at this point I've put it away and I pick it up and I think, oh, where on earth am I starting from? So my recommendation is to, before you do anything, get all the stitches back onto the needles. Now you don't need to do this once you're more practiced, but this definitely gives you an idea of where you are when you're learning this technique. So I've got all my stitches back on the needles. I'm going to point my needle tips to the right like I did at the beginning. Make sure my working yarn is on that back needle. And just repeat what we did before. So because I'm about to start with a knit stitch, I'm going to flip that over the top and pull that needle to the right. And so I've got half the wire on each side. And I've got a free needle now, and I'm ready to knit the second half of this row. So I'm going to knit 2, purl 2 to the end. I've completed one full round, and I'm ready to repeat exactly the same steps as what I did before. So I'm pointing my needle tips to the right. If you notice here that the working yarn is on the front needle and it needs to be on the back needle, all you need to do is flip your needles like that, so it's on the back needle. So all the stitches on your needles, pointed needle tips to the right. Take your working yarn if you're about to start with a knit stitch and take it over your needle and pull that back one to the right until you've got half your cable each side and you're just ready to start knitting your next round. Now I would say Magic Loop is really helpful for socks because you are split in half. So that means when you get to your heel, you can just work backwards and forwards on half your stitches, and the other half can stay on the cable as a stitch holder, so you don't need to do any moving of stitches. And again, for your gusset, you can do gusset on one half and the top of the sock on the other. And again, for your toe, top of the toe, bottom of the toe. So it works really well for socks. It really lends itself well. So hopefully you'll enjoy using the Magic Loop technique.